All right, guys. Sorry.
All right, Ben's back,
Whew.
everybody. All right,
All right, back in the saddle.
back in the saddle.
Yeah,
Cheese and crackers. Okay, so what's your name and what do you do?
sure. So my name is Ben Powers, and I am the executive director of the Southport School and Collab, which is a school and outreach program for students with dyslexia and ADHD. And then I also have the incredible honor to direct the Global Literacy Hub at the Yale Child Study Center, which really is let me turn that off. Sorry. Let me start over again.
No, you're a busy guy. No, that's
Sorry.
important. Keep going. I like
Um,
this.
Thanks, Harvey. So I also have really it's a huge privilege to direct the Global Literacy Hub at the Yale Child Studies Center. And what we do there is we really look to translate the basic science that is done at places like Haskins Labs, which is an epicenter for research on it's a global epicenter of research on spoken and written language acquisition. So we really look to find ways to translate that research for translational and implementation science with a specific emphasis on really reaching individuals in under-resourced communities. And then the third thing I do, which is also something I just take an incredible amount of have an incredible amount of appreciation for, and is something that I'm incredibly passionate about. Is I'm the president of the Dyslexia Foundation, and the Dyslexia Foundation is a unique organization because we host biannual research symposia where we invite 20 to 25 leading researchers from around the world to work together for about 5 days. We kind of lock everybody in the room for 5 days to think about a specific area of research related to dyslexia. So our last meeting was in the summer of 2022, and we focused on executive function and dyslexia. It was chaired by Dr. Lori Cutting. And our next meeting is actually this June of 2024. Dr. Sharon Vaughn from UT Austin and the Meadows Center is going to be chairing that to really be thinking about what can we do to advance the impact we can have for kids with dyslexia in terms of literacy outcomes. So, but in a nutshell, all of my work for the last 25 years really has been focused on finding ways to champion, support, and advance successful outcomes for kids with dyslexia and ADHD.
That's true, but you forgot two things. In your plethora of spare time, you're a father. So you're raising a family of wonderful kids. And wait a minute, aren't we friends? Since you not like one of the other. I thought when you were going to say this, the second thing, I was like, oh, he's going to mention. Then the third, I thought you were going to. But we're friends, right? We know each other, right?
Harvey, I thought we were brothers.
We're like you're kind of a big deal. So because I like just hanging out with you. So okay,
I
so
think we've known each other for 15 years, maybe, Harvey, maybe more, maybe close to 16, 17 years now.
I know.
That's right.
I know. We play a game here on looking at footage and stuff. I'm like, hey, there's Ben when he's like a baby. He's a kid growing up. So yeah, we have all kinds of great pictures of you from before. So we this is like a story about hero's journey, and you're a hero, and so there's a bunch of stuff going on. Who was Ben Powers growing up? What was this like? What was your earliest memories, and why did that Ben Powers grow into this Ben Powers?
That's a great question. I don't know if I'm all grown up yet, Harvey. Um, Spending time with you really helps accelerate that, right? I think at the end of the day, the reason that I do the work that I do is because we have so many kids who struggle in school unnecessarily. And I was one of those kids. Now, when I look at the kinds of kids that come to a school like my school here in Southport, their level of struggle is so significant that they need to come to a program like ours that spends, hours a day really on intensive evidence-based intervention. But, I struggle to learn to read. I have what's called combined type ADHD, which means I can both be inattentive and hyperactive, which, as you know, makes somebody like me really fun at a dinner party. But at the end of the day, that impacted my ability in part to acquire, print acquisition and reading. And so I think it was like second grade, I started to get pulled out of the classroom for working on word attack, word identification, comprehension issues. So I was a good single word decoder, but stringing together, longer phrases, texts, made some parts of reading challenging for me, and especially comprehension. And so that made school tough for me at certain times, especially as I got into middle school, high school, and really had to figure out and access longer texts. I didn't read a whole lot of required books in high school. I tended to read like I tell people like the one book I remember reading was The Great Gatsby because it was so short. The book I did not read was Dr. Zhivago. I watched the movie instead, but I didn't really have an understanding of why I struggled in school or what could have been done differently for me. And long story short, I never expected to end up in schools, but I had a chance to substitute teach shortly after graduating from college. And I'll never forget walking into that classroom the first day as a substitute teacher. It was actually the same middle school I went to, Harvey. And I think it was a 7th grade history class they put me in. It was a Wednesday. And I'll never forget because it was actually the same principal who had been my principal in middle school, brought me to the classroom, left me there and shut the door. And I turned around. I was like, oh my gosh, they're leaving me alone with these kids. But what stood out to me right away was that we could change the conversation for kids. Like it didn't have to feel that same way that I sometimes felt in school. And then I stumbled on this amazing school called the Kildonan School, which had been founded by one of our favorite people in the world, Diana Hanbury King. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, I resonated in some way with the kids that were at Kildonan. Because they all had dyslexia, and I wasn't actually diagnosed with ADHD until I was an adult. So it took me a while to get through this journey and kind of understand who I am as a learner. And I think the beautiful thing is we just know so much more today, and so we can the work that we do really can just impact kids and really can change that conversation for them.
Well, Ben, you're like every mom's dream of all these kids who you really are. It's like, look at you. I mean, say something in Russian, Ben, just in your spare time. Just say something in Russian.
Здравствуйте, Harvey. Как дела?
I mean, like, that's crazy. I mean, I love the way your brain works. And so one day I was hanging out at your school. You've heard me say this a bunch of times. I was just wandering down the hallway with you talking about something important, I guess. And you showed me that the kids don't have lockers. Oh, no, they have lockers, but they don't have locks in their lockers. So right. Tell me, wait a minute, but they're called lockers, but at your school, they don't have locks. How come, Ben?
It's a misnomer. Oh, so I will answer that question in 1 second, Harvey. But here's what I want to say about the Russian. And this is really important for parents out there. Russian was the thing that I felt really good at in school. And it was funny. My mom was really the one who encouraged me to study it. And part of the reason my mom knew it would be good for me was because the classes were really small. Like 7 kids were in the Russian program in my school. So it was really intensive. What she did not know is that Russian has a fairly transparent orthography, meaning the sound symbol relationship is pretty direct. So actually, even though Russian is a different alphabet, it's in a way, it's much easier to decode, which at the time didn't really factor into the decision making. But anyway, long story short, Russian was the thing that I just became really good at and known for. And actually people knew that I studied that. And so it was something that gave me that boost in school. And the reason that's important for parents, Harvey, is because I think oftentimes when we think about dyslexia or ADHD, we focus on the deficits of like what can't they do? And I think to me, like that was my saving grace in school was the Russian. That's what made me feel like a learner and that I could be successful in the classroom more than anything else. So
small classes, good self-esteem, right? All of a sudden, your mom found something, you were good at it. They kept you at it. I mean, there's a lot of keys in that, isn't there?
That's it. And actually, the really cool thing, and I should probably talk about this more, was I had an amazing Russian teacher, Helena Donchenko. Her Russian name was Galia Stepanovna. And she taught in a way that resonated with me. And like, so the word for purse in Russian is sumka. And so she would use visuals or auditory cues, like she would draw a picture of a clam and, it resonated with me. So there were a lot of reasons I was successful with that. But also the environment that got created in that classroom and the way she created that environment. And that's actually, to transition to your question about the lockers, that's actually what's so critical, I think, for our kids. At the end of the day, pedagogy, curriculum, teacher training, all those things, professional development, all those things are critically important because we need to put the best research and evidence-based practices in front of our kids. But environment, I think we know environment is really crucial. And it's part of why we have lockers here, but it's a complete misnomer. There's no locks on them because part of what we want to do in a community to build that culture, to make that environment as strong as it can be, is to build trust. And with our kids, many of whom have really struggled in mainstream learning environments, rebuilding trust is the absolute first thing we need to do. And so at the end of the day, what we really think about is how do we build trust in our community? And part of that for us is really coming at it from a perspective that we should start from a lens of let's trust everybody from the beginning. And so we don't have locks on our lockers. And guess how much theft we have, Harvey?
I love it. None.
Right?
None.
And we have kids coming from all over the place. Over 35 communities are represented here. We have kids who drive quite literally almost 2 hours a day in one direction to get to our school. So we have all different types of kids coming from all different types of communities. And they go home to different places at the end of the day. But when they're here, they can feel really safe. And we know kids need to feel safe in school to learn, to be able to, reduce those cortisol levels and be able to feel comfortable is so important.
Ben, so you're a researcher. It's safe to say that you're a researcher. You're the president of the Dyslexia Foundation. You work with the hub at Haskins, and so you're surrounded by science. You're dealing with this all the time. You're an educator. You run a school. So all of this new science that's coming out in the science of literacy, how do we get it into practice in the school? Not just your school. Your school is great. You got a bunch of superheroes, but you see the barrier that we're going to have. We have all this great science. It's not a pendulum swinging back and forth. I was talking to Emily Hanford the other day. It's not the pendulum. The pendulum's walking. The pendulum is walking. Science is going this way. This is undeniable stuff. But how do we get it into not just a great school like the Southport School, but into these public schools? How do we get it to these teachers that'll be able to take this information and put that into the classroom?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Harvey. I think, when people ask me what kind of music I like, it's hard for me to answer because I love all different kinds of music, all over the place. And I think one of the advantages I've had in my career is having kind of being able to dance on a lot of different dance floors. And so, I get to start my day here with kids and see them come out of their cars or their buses and be excited to come to school and, meet and talk with teachers and see what's happening in the classrooms and kind of incremental shifts that are happening with, changes in, how kids come into school today versus 5 or 10 years ago. I've been lucky too to have, a foot in the research community and be able to work with just some of the, the greatest people who've done just phenomenal work like Ken Pugh or Fumiko Huft or Lori Cutting or Mark Seidenberg. And, I have the great fortune of kind of being able to stand on their shoulders because, they've done all the heavy lifting. But to be involved with some of the, projects with like Ken, doing a really cool research study right now. It's a huge NIH grant to think about, how can we individualize instruction for kids? And so, yeah, it's really awesome to be part of that. The big gap, as we know, though, Harvey, is, that connection between the classroom and research. And that's part of what TDF really tries to bridge is that bi-directional relationship between researchers and practitioners. And I think that's a key. A lot of the science happens in schools of psychology, and we talk about the chasm between the schools of psychology and the schools of education. But the flip side is we also don't get a lot of feedback back to the researchers from practitioners who are doing work with kids in the classroom. And so it's why I'm grateful to have this kind of ability to be able to have a dance card that's so full, and for the work that happens at a place like TDF. What I will tell you, Harvey, is I think, a big piece for schools right now and for educators, and this is actually more recently more of the work that I've been involved with through the Southport Collab is going out and, working with schools and thinking about how to translate what we know from science into the hands of all classroom teachers, because every single kid we know, and the crazy part is the kinds of things we've been doing for so long in schools like this, or in specialized communities that serve kids with dyslexia. What we now know from the science is that while kids with dyslexia need more of it, they need a higher dosage, or more aggressive intervention. The tenets of what we do using the alphabetic principle, having a structured literacy approach, teaching things like morphology, the kinds of things we do in a school like ours benefit all learners, because we weren't wired to read. And so I think there are a few key things we need to be doing, Harvey. One is we need to stop blaming people. We need to stop talking about these reading wars in a way. I mean, we just have such clear science now. There's to me, a war is when there's miscommunication or people are arguing over something that we don't have a strong basis for. But we have such a strong basis for the science of reading. There's really no reason to have a war anymore. We just know. We see it from work that's done at a place like Haskins with fMRI, EEG, other work that's done from cognitive science, neuroscience, genetics. I mean, we just have such clarity on this. So I think we need to stop blaming people. I certainly think we need to stop blaming educators. A lot of this challenge is, giving pre-service educators in undergraduate and graduate school more dosage of how to teach literacy. In Connecticut, there's really only 2 classes that are required to have teachers teach, elementary school kids. That's not nearly enough. And part of it is just having open, honest conversations and getting feedback and helping teachers understand, where does this research come from? What does it mean? What does that look like in practice? And getting them to take healthy risks of, and trying new things and giving them the support to implement that effectively. Teachers have a heavy load. They have a lot on their plate, from, the struggles with individual kids to the curriculum to testing, all these things. So, we really need to work with them and empower them to be, as effective as they can be in a way that is supportive and champions them as well.
Well, yeah, you said a lot right there. The teachers, and I'm going to go back to the pendulum, because these teachers have said, well, I've seen this before, I've seen that before. But how do we get it to them and say, this really is the science, we've built this upon this, upon this, upon this. And the average teacher who is overworked and underpaid, and they have empathy, they want to help these kids, especially the early elementary school teachers, the ones who are teaching your kids how to read, those first grade teachers, like the ones we made the film about. How do we get in front of every one of these teachers in the country and say, no, this is the real deal. The war is over. Wait a minute. I just wanted to say one thing. Remember those guys after the Second World War? There was a couple Japanese soldiers still left in the mountains and on the islands that didn't know the war was over.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Right. So nobody told them. And then when they did tell them, they're like, no, you're fooling me. So the science is out there. We got the science. We got to get this practice into all classrooms, and you're going to say this is going to work for 95% of the kids. They're going to get it. Yes.
Yeah. So look, I think yes. At the end of the day, I think what we're seeing with some of the recent changes with, shifts from some major players in this space, look what just happened with Readers Writers Workshop and Teachers College. Separating. I mean. At the end of the day, as much as maybe there were incremental shifts in how curricula was trying to change, it was still built on things like the 3 queuing system, which we just, and I think at the end of the day, look, why do teachers go, why do people become teachers? People become teachers because they want to work with kids and help kids and support kids. And then we put them in that classroom, K1, 2, and I think your film does a beautiful job, Harvey, of looking at how we can effectively support teachers, especially in a community like Waterbury, where there are a lot of compounding factors. Teachers go into the profession because they want to help kids, they want to support kids, and I think at the end of the day, we also are asking teachers to achieve a level of professional education. I mean, teachers need a master's degree in most states. within a certain window of time. Like that's a big deal. I mean, you hear somebody who goes and gets their MBA to be, in business. Like everybody's like, oh wow, they got an MBA. A master's in education is also a serious thing, and so, we need to treat teachers as the professionals they are. And I know you're a proponent of that from all the conversations we've had. But I also think it's, helping them understand, and I'll give you a very specific example of why the three queuing system does not work. One of the pictures, the visuals I like to give in a talk is this worksheet that my youngest daughter, brought home from school called Eagle Eyes, and there's a picture of an eagle, and it says, when you're stuck on a word, look at and there's a blank line, and the answer is supposed to be pictures. Well, number one, I don't know about you, but most books aren't showing pictures that can help you decode every word. But even if they did, what we're asking kids to do in that case is lift their eyes off the print, get distracted, try to find something else to help answer that. And that's not only inefficient. I mean, we know that. Mark Seidenberg's done a lot of research on this. And he talks about, why, the reading circuit is much more efficient when we're connecting when we're connecting the alphabetic principle, but especially for kids with things like working memory deficits. If you have a working memory deficit, and working memory is like RAM in a computer, you can have the biggest hard drive, but if your RAM is impacted, you're going to get that spinning wheel of death on your MacBook and shut down. And so when we're asking kids, learning to read is a complicated process, we're actually exacerbating it by asking them to lift their eyes off the print and go find something else. We're taxing their working memory at a time when they're already overloaded developing this circuitry. And so, I think talking through with teachers and helping them understand why the science of reading is more effective, those conversations, in my experience, those conversations are really helpful because it helps teachers understand why this makes sense scientifically and why it's more effective. And then when you can show them that, wow, look, actually, although, and Diana wrote that book, English Isn't Crazy, although, English has what's called a deep orthography because it's made up of several languages, and we've got, 26 letters that compose 44 different sounds, 44 different phonemes. It is mostly decodable, and it is especially decodable when kids get into fourth and fifth grade and start getting exposed to textbooks where most of the language is based in Latin and Greek. So I think through helping coach and share that with teachers and getting away from this is right and this is wrong and you've been doing it the wrong way and now we're swinging this pendulum back to the this other way, the right way. That conversation to me is not helpful. It's really helping explain and show, just like we would want to do with kids in the classroom. It's modeling that same learning experience that we know is effective for kids with teachers, and again, treating them as the professionals they are. So,
well, I mean, you put it into layman's terms. One of the things that I've been calling you for many years. Just to try to explain complicated information so we could, you're one of our advisors, one of our consultants that we go to. We try not to bother you too much, but reading is rocket science. Reading is a little crazy. And the fact that we can get this and make this simple for people to understand, I think that's one of the important things. And you're a great educator, Ben, and I appreciate you.
Sorry.
I appreciate you for it. So, matter of fact, you've looked at a couple rough cuts of our film, and you've kind of held our hand and nursed it along as we've been growing, and you're going to see it. Well, you've seen the whole thing now, but you're going to see it. You're going to see it at the IDA. You're actually on our panel at the IDA. So
I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it.
So okay, so tell everybody about our film. Why is it good? Why is it bad? What do you like about it? What do you hate about it?
Harvey, I what I love about the film is that it's genuine. I mean, it's a real look at an incredible effort to think about how to shift and refocus curriculum, teaching, instruction, and in a place like Waterbury, and Waterbury is it's one of the most diverse communities, certainly in Connecticut, but even across this country, it's incredibly diverse. There are also some real significant challenges in a community like Waterbury. I mean, there's a lot of disenfranchisement. there's socioeconomic challenges. So there's a lot to tackle. And I think this is really important. I'm going to go back to what you said about, this 95%. We know with effective evidence-based instruction, we can get kids to read. There's always going to be a percentage of what we call non-responders. I also think it's really important that everybody understands a few things. It's not just about reading. We also have to think about, what other factors are impacting kids and how can we support them? I mean, nutrition is a key thing. And again, this is something that, gets covered in your film. They talk about some of the compounding factors, school attendance. I mean, there's a number of things. It's not just getting the right curriculum in place. That alone is not going to solve our problem. And I think that's one of the things I love about your film, Harvey, is it's taking a real look at what's happening in a system like Waterbury, but how, through, hard work and heavy lifting, but by being really focused and dedicated and passionate about making this change, that a community can do it. And it's not easy. And I think it's also hard. Sometimes people expect to have immediate results. And anytime we implement something new, there's a learning curve. It takes time for people to get comfortable with it. That change causes stress for people. We know that. And so, we also have to have realistic expectations about that, progress rate of change and outcomes. But, I love that it follows this story of, and especially from the vantage point of, being at eye level with these kids and really seeing it, too, from their experience, and the overlay of how this connects that gap between the research and the science and how we can make stronger connections there. So I really love what you've done with the film. It's really, really amazing.
Well, we appreciate it. We appreciate all the hard work you put into it and helped us out. So we believe in this thing that all the kids are using, this thing called the internet. And
I've heard of it.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of stuff. Just even, I mean, I think I knew you before Decoding Dyslexia started. I know I knew you before Decoding Dyslexia started.
We definitely knew. That's right.
And so when they first showed up, it's like, I used to hang out at this conference with the IDA, and there was a bunch of researchers and educators there, just like Orton and Gillingham. It was researchers, it was scientists, and it was educators. And then these parents showed up, and then these parents started listening to all this, and they were the ones who went through legislation, and they would take all this information. But I think what happened is at nighttime they get together and they drink their coffee or their tea or their wine or whatever they drink, and they pass this information back and forth that they find on the internet, which I think is incredibly powerful. So that's something that's changing. So that's something to be able to get in front of these policymakers, the decision makers, the lawmakers, the Board of Education, school superintendents. I say this all the time because I know it's not a reading war. It is a reading war. They're even having a war on if it's a war or not.
Yeah, Harvey, you're absolutely right. I think, look, it's, and we've seen, I mean, you talk about the internet, and it's an amazing thing. I mean, look, we've seen on, social media, the way grassroots organization through social media has impacted, literally impacted and helped create meaningful revolutions in countries, right? And I think that's really kind of what's happened in, People ask, like, well, how long, is this science new? How long have we had it? We've known this science for a while, Harvey. Will Baker, who was the president and founder of the Dyslexia Foundation, when he helped establish the first brain bank in this country to study the brains of people with dyslexia, which was up at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center with Dr. Hal Galaberta and colleagues, people like Gordon Sherman, and at that time, they literally, Will would fly out, somebody with dyslexia who passed away, if they had signed, a consent form, he would fly out, he would almost kind of have like an igloo cooler, collect the brain, fly it back to the lab, and so they could dissect it. And, there weren't that many brains to work with, and it was only done, post-mortem. Where today, we have so much more, imaging research, we can do so much more. But even back then, we could see, there were visible differences in brain structure. We've known this for a long time. The challenge is, there wasn't really a way to kind of bring it together and disseminate it. And even with the internet, And I agree, the internet's an awesome tool. We still aren't in the best place to be able to disseminate this knowledge. It's something I think, and I was talking to a colleague this morning about this, Augusto Bookweitz, who's at UConn now. He's done some amazing research on literacy acquisition, especially in communities with trauma and PTSD, and looking at factors like resiliency. We were talking this morning about, that whole notion of, how translational science and implementation science are going to be so critical. And this is where I go back to, thinking about how we work with teachers and train teachers. The internet's also full of a lot of content like Teachers Pay Teachers. And I think Teachers Pay Teachers right now is like the number one resource that teachers are pulling content from. But we need to help educate and inform teachers how to be informed consumers of research, because as much as there's a lot of positive dissemination on the internet, we also have to be really mindful of what is out there. And a lot of people talk about the science of reading or the science of literacy, and what's really important to understand about that is there's no one science of reading, there's no one science of literacy, and we don't have all these questions answered. There's still so much work to do. Otherwise, researchers wouldn't have a job. I mean, there's so much research still needed to be done. What the science of reading really means is, what do we know that's been validated? And when I say validated, I mean, really replicated and validated through good studies, really good study design. What do we know has been proven to work for kids? And we need to use, what we know from science to put in front of our kids today. But there's no one, there's no one science, there's no one curriculum, there's no one answer to this. It's saying, okay, what do we know works from science? How can we share that with teachers to inform best practice in the classroom? That's a difficult job, and it's going to take some time to make sure we can get that done the right way.
Ben, I want to go. You got me thinking in so many different ways. My neurons are firing all over the place here. So, in one way, I want to follow the path about how we get it to the teachers. How the teachers know if it smells good and if it's stale and past. What's good science? What's the easy ways for the teachers, for the policymakers, the Board of Education, for the politician, for any of the decision makers, teachers, parents, anybody? How do they find that out? But then I want to go back to what you were saying about your relationship with, maybe it's a two-part question. Your relationship with you and Will, how that happened, and now you're the president. Will Baker passed away, and so you have a legacy. And you have several legacies that you're carrying on. And so as now moving into a different position in your life, and I know your passions, you have to get this information to the right people. How do you do it, and how do they know if it's the right information?
So actually, Harvey, it is two different questions, but it's actually so beautifully intertwined. Will was my best friend, and he was also a really important mentor in my life. And one of the things that really shifted, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about the Dyslexia Foundation is when I first got to know Will and started attending meetings, I really did not know much about being an informed consumer of research. And, Will really encouraged me to go back to school and to focus on my education. Because, the whole point of Will founding, the reason Will founded the Dyslexia Foundation was because he had been a medical student at Duke University, and he was asked to leave because of his dyslexia. He could not meet some of the benchmarks that needed to be met in the classroom setting, although he could in the operating room. He was actually assisting doctors when he was there, but unfortunately, he needed things like extended time. He needed a reader scribe. And at that time, this was in the 1960s, they didn't provide for that. And so he was really disappointed, but knew that we would only really be able to change the conversation if we could A, advance the science, and then B, make sure that science got into the hands of educators. And so when I joined the dyslexia, or when I became involved with the Dyslexia Foundation and started to get to know Will, I thought I knew a lot about education. I was working with kids with dyslexia, And I thought I understood, what research was, and I realized I didn't. And so, Will really encouraged me to go back to school, and that's actually how I ended up going back and getting my doctorate. And the biggest takeaway for me from that experience was really being able to read through research, understand, important questions like who's doing, who's doing this research, what was the research design, what was the research based on, the design study, what was it based on, the statistical analysis, is the data being evaluated the right way, and then who's validating this, is this peer reviewed, or is this just something that's out and published? And there's a huge difference between a survey and research. And so, I still have so much to learn. But what I will tell you at the end of the day, that was the biggest takeaway for me, was to say, okay, before we put something in front of kids have such a limited amount of time. We have them in school really for, 13 years. K through 12 is 13 years. They get 9 months times, 13. That's not a lot of time. And so any day that we're putting something in front of them that is not built on good theory or good evidence is a day that, is very likely to be wasted with them. And unfortunately, and not for bad, through bad intention at all. But unfortunately, a lot of what we've been putting in front of kids in this country regarding literacy for decades has not been based on what we know is best practice from the evidence and research. So, I think, helping teachers as they're going through pre-service, which is when they're in undergrad or in graduate school, helping them, really understand, teaching them, should they be vetting things, should they be looking at things, because look, the research is always going to be changing too. If you're a doctor, it's the same thing. When you graduate from med school, you need to keep learning. You need to keep reading academic papers and medical journals because practices are going to change. Cancer treatment today is very different than it was, even 5 years ago. And so again, we learn more about better ways to acquire literacy in the printed word, every year. And so, we need to help teachers be part of that, almost like a medical model that way.
Well, I think you just, I always feel like Tennessee Tuxedo, breaking out. Remember that? He would come over and ask the professor stuff. It's like, wow, that's it. That's the answer. So, going back to the reading wars here. So you just told me about science, and then you told me how to vet science. We can check out the studies that are being done and peer reviewed, and some of the stuff that happened that we've been growing up with, and the 3Qing, the look-see, and all of this stuff is good ideas. Somebody came up with a good idea, just like you said. Well, hey, you knew a lot about education, but then you kept learning more. And you learned it from these great minds, Ken Pugh and from ECO and Mark Seidenberg. So these are credible places where it's coming from. Some of this stuff that's happened before I'll say. I mean, if I say Francis and Purnell or Lucille Calkins, it was like ideas that people got, and then they kind of built their business on it, and it seemed like a good idea in teaching, and for teachers to kind of go into that seems like a good idea. So sure. So I guess there is a reading war on. I guess the answer is science is science, and if you invest in the science, it can help you with your classroom. It will help you understand more. Am I close?
Yeah, look, that's right. I mean, Harvey, look, we're both parents. I've had a ton of good ideas as a parent that have not worked out well at all, right? And part of that experience is trying something, testing it, seeing the result. As a parent, and I've got 4 kids. My sample size is pretty small, but those things are only in large part relevant to my kids. Those experiences. I can take those. I can try things. I can test things and figure out what's going to work for my 4 kids. We don't have that luxury in school. We can't be sitting down and trying and testing things, especially when we have new kids every year. I mean, that's not the way we should be doing things. And so, at the end of the day, I think, you're exactly right. We've got to really be thinking about, and again, it wasn't for bad intention, but we really didn't have the capacity to measure some of these things. And I'll go back to the, what Will was doing with those brains. I mean, it wasn't, you know, it was hard to build that brain bank. I mean, you had to find people, you had to harvest the brains. Those brains were no longer alive. So, now we can scan part of this R37 grant with Ken. It's his merit and NIH merit grant. Part of what he's doing with that grant is part of it is imaging kids. It's called serial imaging. We use, what used to happen is a kid would get scanned with an fMRI, they'd have an intervention, and then they would do a post-intervention fMRI a while later. And you could see brain changes, right, from pre-intervention to post-intervention. Part of what, the study that Ken is leading is doing is really seeing, like, okay, can we also understand what's happening during intervention? What's changing in brain during intervention? We couldn't do that technology didn't exist, when things like FNP were developed. And so, in all fairness, people base things qualitatively on like what looked like or seemed like it worked in maybe a limited case, without really, testing that across and validating it across a large sample. And of course, now several things have changed. Number one, the expectation in research is that we're holding to a higher standard of evidence basis, that we're doing randomized controlled trials, right? That we're, not just selecting a group of kids and trying something with them and writing a paper on our own, that there's, much more collaboration, there's a higher level of validation expected, and there are far more, rigorous tools that we can employ to measure these things. And I think at the end of the day, that's the big piece. And unfortunately, it hasn't necessarily caught up with a lot of these curricula that have been embedded for so long that, feel good and they feel right to people, but they don't actually necessarily work effectively. And we know they don't work effectively for a lot of kids. It's not just kids with dyslexia, as you know, Harv, from all your work in this space and doing your film. It just doesn't work for a lot of kids.
So I guess the thing has been, you've been around the greats. You've been touched by the great ones. Will Baker. Even Diana King. So you had to hold to a pretty higher standard of being an educator and a researcher. So, you were like Diana King's golden child. You really were. So how come and why, you went there, you had an experience. Let's just talk about Diana King for a minute, because she's kind of somebody who was important in both of our lives. And so tell me, what did you learn from being around an educator like Diana? And tell me about your experiences. Tell us about your experiences.
Well, I'll tell you the biggest lesson I learned from Diana, Harvey, and I think this won't be a surprise to you. The biggest thing I learned from Diana is that it's incumbent upon us to help every kid we can. Look, accessing a school like mine is difficult. Parents, it's a lot of money. Or parents have to fight a broken system to get support and resources to be able to enroll their child in a school like this. And like I said, we have kids, we've had kids who have driven almost 2 hours one way to get here. So there's a lot of challenges with coming to a school like this. Diana really taught me that, we have to share the wealth. We have to share that knowledge and experience. It's part of, especially toward the end of her career, really what she was focused on. And that's part of what we do here at the Southport School. Like, we have partnerships in Bridgeport where we go in, we help screen kids, we provide resources so we can help those teachers and those families, especially with the kids who are most impacted. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that I learned from Diana, was that it's, it's not enough that we have this knowledge to share with like the kids in our immediate classroom or community, that it's incumbent upon us to really push out and share that. The second thing I actually learned from Diana, and it's funny, you say that as your golden boy. What's funny about Diana to me, I was so in fear of Diana before I even ever met her, because not only was she so revered, but she was a tough cookie. I mean, Harvey, she had really high expectations. And she certainly taught me that that's a really important piece, is that we've got to hold high expectations for all kids. So I was like petrified to meet her, because I'd heard all these, stories about how tough she was and how rigorous she was and how she had these really high expectations. And what I would say that's what's interesting to me is, I think part of that, what I learned from working with her, and part of the reason we developed a close relationship, was because I pushed back. One of the first encounters we had was something I disagreed with her about. I'll never forget. She used a word. I was tutoring a kid, and I was explaining the definition of a word, and she told me that was wrong. The definition was wrong, and I thought I was right, and so I didn't do it in front of the kid. But afterward, we talked about it. And then she came back to me the next day and she said, "You know what, Ben, you were actually correct. That definition was right. It's not the primary definition, but it's another definition for that word I did not know." And what I learned from that is that, and I think this is really important as we think about classroom instruction and we think about why we're in the position we are today with some of the curricula that people have just kind of followed blindly. We have to be really careful not to make the same mistake again, Harvey. We can't just say, this is now the answer, the one answer, and follow that blindly either. We've got to ask challenging questions. We've got to push back, because it's only through that pushback and that healthy tension and friction that we're going to end up in a better place. And that's something that really, really facilitated that relationship between me and Diana over all the years that we worked together. And she was my mentor for close to 20 years in a way. That was something that was always a healthy debate between us. And it's always something that I think pushed both of us forward.
No, it was great. You guys were a great team, great friendship, and it was beautiful seeing you guys together. So, and I know Diana always told us she would say onward. And
onward, that's right. Exactly right. That's it, onward.
Onward. So, I ain't no highfalutin researcher like you. I ain't no educator like you. But so we made this film. Who should see the film, and how can it help in the reading confluence situation?
So actually, Harvey, it's a great question. But I think the reverse question is actually better. Like, who shouldn't see this film? Because I really can't think of anybody who shouldn't see this film. I mean, I think parents need to see it. Teachers need to see it. Schools of ed need to see it. People in the schools of ed and higher ed where we're training teachers. I would say actually probably maybe the most important audience are school administrators. I think for teachers to be able to be effective in the classroom, they've got to have the support they need. And support comes, resources, teacher training, professional development, but also building leadership. And unfortunately, if you think about where school administrators come from, they come from the classroom. And so likely themselves, they have not had the kind of training or background in effective literacy instruction or the science of reading. Again, like in Connecticut, there are only 2 undergrad classes required around literacy instruction, and they're pretty vague. And so, it's more than likely the individuals running our school systems, running our schools, probably don't have that information. So I think it's actually really important, not just so they get that information, but also so they can see like what happened in Waterbury in such a really diverse and oftentimes challenging environment, that it's possible. That if you make this commitment, if you bring people together, if you focus on the good and the positive and what we can shift, that really great things can happen.
Yep. Well, that's true. It does take a village, and it's happening all the time, and everybody has to kind of get involved. So you don't need a soapbox because you're Ben Powers. You're Dr. Ben Powers. So you don't need a soapbox, and people do come and see you, and they're going to see you talk on our panel, but they come and see you talk. But what else can you say right now? We talked about a lot of things, and we could talk for hours, and we will continue talking at various times in our life and later. But in this conversation, what else that we haven't touched base on that people should know? And I love it, the administrators, or because a lot of times people don't want to let people know what they don't know, and they're in a position of authority. I mean, I liked what you said. We're still learning. We're still learning all the time. But what would you like to tell people that you haven't said
You know,
already?
I think what I would tell people is, look, we know a lot of, we don't have all the answers. We don't. And I think, unfortunately, this is part of the underlying tension with this whole notion of the reading wars is, look, nobody has all the answers. And if anybody, we know in any space, if anybody tells you they have all the answers, we know they're wrong, right? I mean, that's just not reality. And unfortunately, sometimes the things we think we know the best, or the things we feel the strongest about, sometimes are the things we're the most wrong about. But here's what we do have: we have a lot of settled science in this space, and so if we can all focus and agree on the settled science, that's really what's going to help push us forward. There are still more, there are still things we need to understand better. We don't have all the answers. And I think, and it's justified, one of the biggest, I think, frustrations or complaints, and I get this question, pretty regularly, like, okay, so, people say, oh, so Ben, what's the one screener we should be using? Or what's the one curriculum we should be using? And unfortunately, I think teachers, school districts, parents, even, they get frustrated because it's hard for researchers to answer those questions. Because there isn't one single answer. And we also know that, on a basis of science, we also have individual difference in students. And so, differentiated instruction is really important. Kids need different levels of dosage for certain things. So while all students are going to benefit from, an approach to reading that's built on the science of reading, within that science of reading, the dosage for different areas of instruction needs to be differentiated. So there's a lot that needs to happen. But, if we can really focus on what we know is the settled science, and that is absolutely clear, then, at least we have a strong foundation to build the rest of our house on. Just like when you build a house, you might have an architectural change on the line, or think, oh, you know what, now that I've seen this, it's going to work better this way, and we might need to do a renovation. But if the foundation is strong, and if we build that foundation on what we know from the science of reading, we're going to have a house we can live in for a long time to come.
I love that. And houses make villages, and villages raise kids. And yep, call me crazy. But
I'll just tell you one last thing. I heard this. I was with Dr. Jay Russell earlier this week at the Rockefeller Institute, and one of the things he said, and it's actually true. It's the opposite way I look at things. But he said, it doesn't. If you could care less about kids, if you could care less about reading, if you could care less about outcomes like that, even if you don't care about any of those things, at the end of the day, even our economic outcome in this country, even our ability to be leaders, a global leader in the as the U.S. We will not be a healthy and prosperous nation unless we are a literate nation. It's just absolutely clear. And when about a third of our kids are meeting proficient reading benchmarks by fourth and eighth grade, that should be a huge red flag for any capitalist, anybody who cares about the health and wealth of this nation. I hope we care about kids. I hope we care about outcomes. I'm an eternal optimist. I think you know that, Harvey. So I'd like to believe everybody feels that way. But even if you don't, this is paramount to our collective future success.
Think of the world, Ben, if everybody could read. If 95% of us could read. And everybody followed their passion, and everybody had empathy for other people and understanding, and would want to understand things, and could. What Diana did was she looked up the definition because she knew how to read. And
that's right.
And then she realized, hey, I'm wrong, and I'm going to go down and talk to this young guy and say that. So, yeah, hooray reading. You got to love it.
That's right. That's absolutely right, Harvey.
All right. Well, I think we did it, Ben. I think I appreciate your time. I know you're a busy guy. And
well, Harvey, thanks so much. And of course, I appreciate our friendship. This is, you've been one of those champions for me too along the way. You've helped me grow and become a better a better advocate in this space, and you always make me think. So I think that's a big takeaway that people are going to get from your film. I love it because it's going to make people think. And everything we can do to help enact change and get people generating these conversations of change is huge. And it's we're at the right moment. So I'm grateful for not just your friendship, but for the work you're doing to really help give voice to the voiceless, Harvey. So thank you.
And I'm grateful for you, your friendship, and all the hard work you do. Onward, Ben. Onward.
Onward, Harvey.